My goodness, welcome to the smooth sounds of Denver After Dark. I tell you, I love that intro, Doug. It's still brilliant every time I see it. And it reminds me that it is late at night, it's live. I wish we certainly had that scene, but I'm in the mountains, the Blue Ridge Mountains out here. So if there's a cab that drives up, they're probably going to, my wife is probably going to go out there armed. But no, it's great to be here tonight. And we got such a special, special guest tonight. Colonel Cedric Leighton, and I just want to tell you about him really quick. We've crossed paths multiple times here over the last few years, but as me and Colonel Leighton were talking, I figured it out, and we figured it out that we had breathed a lot of the same air, especially starting back in 9/11, right before then, through that into the National Security Agency. His intelligence background is incredible, and if you go and watch him on CNN today, which you have to go watch him, he mentioned something, an aircraft called an RC-135, and the first thing I thought was rivet joint. Now, if you guys look up at intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance aircraft, how we do mission planning, and you talk about sort of the complexities or some of the professional type of training that you have to do in order to do a full mission plan or a guerrilla package, Colonel Leighton's an expert on this. He's an expert even beyond where I went. Right, I was enlisted, went to captain, and then went into NSA Special Projects. Colonel Leighton continued, obviously, as an 06. A man I very much respect and very excited to talk about Venezuela tonight. And before we get to him, after that, I'm going to try to keep it concise. You know, it's interesting. You know, I've in Congress, done incredible things, and still when I talk to somebody like Colonel Leighton, I sort of refer back to, we got to be concise, on point, make sure I don't waste his time. I mean, it's fantastic. And he knows, he's probably laughing, right? He's backstage probably laughing, going, oh my gosh, Deborah, you're so right. You're so right. He gets it. So I'm excited about that. After we talk to Colonel Leighton, I'll let him go so he can get some shut eye. He's had a long day too. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about January 6th and some of my ideas for Tuesday. With the text messages where I asked the question if I should read them. I don't know if I can get through all 2,319 in context. So Doug and I had a pretty good discussion about what we could do there. But without further ado, I would like to present the incredible Colonel Cedric Leighton. I'm going to bring him in now and pretty excited to see him. So if we could add him to the stage, Doug, there he is. And by the way, how you doing tonight, Colonel?
Hey, I'm doing great, Denver. Great to be with you. Thanks so much for having me here.
Well, I'll tell you this. So as you can see, Colonel Leighton coming from a black site tonight, a secret site. And nobody knew that Brad Pitt was actually Colonel Cedric Leighton. And that's fantastic from Doug. But, you know, I was listening to you today and, you know, you heard me on the introduction about some of the things you were talking about with mission planning and looking at what's going on in Venezuela. And before we get into the politics of it, I do want to tell the audience that Colonel Leighton will say what he's comfortable with as we're going into Venezuela and what we're talking about here. He is a retired Colonel Leighton with his own companies in cyber. But this is going to be an interesting conversation because of the technical intelligence aspects, and we do speak the same language. So we're going to try not to, and Colonel Leighton, I'll try not to acronym this up either, you know what I'm saying, as we go forward. Yeah. But looking at what happened, and I first want to ask you, and just sort of in general way, looking at the operational mission specifically and what you saw. Hegseth said something interesting. He said, never happened like this before. And I laughed earlier today. I was on an interview and I'm like, no, this has been done before, you know, in very huge ways. Yeah. But looking at this operation, what is your first general consensus on the way the operation was executed and some of the things that you saw with Maduro and what was happening in Venezuela today?
Yeah, Denver, I looked at the way they did this, and it was definitely well choreographed. I think the mission, from a military standpoint, and from what they were told to do and how they executed it, was basically flawless. I think the most important part of it was the fact that they were able to integrate all the different platforms. And by platforms, when we talk platforms, then when I talk about different aircraft, manned aircraft, helicopters, UAVs, all of those things coming together, plus overhead assets, in other words, satellites. So all of these things are integrated. And, really the key thing here that a lot of people, I think, on the outside don't understand, or sometimes it's glossed over, is the fact that the command and control that is required to execute something like this is really incredible, and nobody does it better than the United States when it comes to this kind of thing. That's something I think is really critical. But yeah, in general terms, you're right about the fact that when Secretary Hegseth mentioned that this had never been done before. That's not true. It has been done before many times. You and I were involved in a post 9/11 world, when we did the first part of Operation Iraqi Freedom, the shock and awe phase. I was intimately involved in that. And the way that came together was even more intricate than this, but that does not take away from what the people did who executed this mission. They did this in a really good way. And what's also interesting about this is, a lot of Air Force people, like you and I, we, of course, focus on the aircraft and on how all of that comes together. But this was a marriage of what the aircraft do and what special ops does. And I've been able to bridge both of those worlds, during my career. And it was great to see that just from a purely operational standpoint. That I think was something that was quite remarkable and well done in this case.
I do too. And, I think about something else that you said. I remember, 9/11 happens, and I know a lot of people on here obviously remember that. We went from 9/11, I deployed 10 days later. It was around, September 21st, I think, Colonel. And then, by October 7th, we were dropping bombs on caves,
Mm-hmm.
in Mazar-e Sharif and Tor Bora, right? And, but I sort of remember the heightened sort of ops tempo at the time, and
Mm-hmm.
how we were able to turn. And by the way, remember 2001, we were still dorking with electronic target folders, trying to, all this
Yes.
stuff. We had a
Yes.
combination of electronic and target folders, and we're using flip cards for initial points, right, for targeting.
Right. Right.
It was insane. The analog with the digital then, and trying. And I'm 31, and I'm like a monkey humping a football, as that term there is. We're going. So, we had all
Yes.
that going on. But what's incredible to me? You said something today, and I'm like, man, he's on it. And you said, it took months of planning. Now, 9/11
Yeah.
was a special thing, but that was the thing that I don't know if the interviewer even caught on to what you were saying. And I know that people are like, well, Denver, of course. No, not of course. It's a very, very incredible thing that you said it that way, because it showed that this wasn't a spontaneous operation, but something that had been in effect for some time, because we know how long that takes. And if you want to
Mm-hmm.
explain to folks why, when you said it took months, the guy just sort of glossed over it, why I thought that was so fascinating.
Well, it's interesting because I remember, just by way of comparison, the run up to the shock and awe part of Iraqi freedom, which, if people remember, that was really the first part. That's where, let's say, that was the most intense air power aspect of that operation of, what now is basically called the Second Gulf War. And that was something where we practiced it. I went down to Shaw Air Force Base in South Carolina, and with a team of people. And we were integrated into what's known as the Air Operations Center. And we literally practiced how we would do stuff on day one. And, if we were going to attack a target, we would select the targets, we'd pick them as if it was the real thing. And, those that didn't meet the criteria because they were a mosque or a hospital or a school or something like that, they were taken off the target list. But the legitimate targets, things like command and control nodes, air bases, leadership installations, all of those things, they were practiced on, basically. Now that was in the format of a command post exercise, which means that actual bombs don't drop on targets. But that was all part of the training, because what's done in a command post, in this case, really the Air Operations Center, is then what is executed when you actually go to war. And that's what these people did, in the operation for Venezuela. And that really, that's where everything comes together. And somebody said once, unfortunately I can't attribute the quote to a specific person, but they said that when you're in combat, it's in some ways easier because you've practiced it so often. And so if you do your job right as a military person, it's not because you're going for the blood and guts, so to speak. But what you're looking for is to do it precisely. To do it, if you're a real professional, you want to make sure that you kill the least amount of people. And hopefully, if you can achieve the effect without killing anybody, that's even better. And that's the kind of thing where, information warfare, cyber warfare, those kinds of things really become important because they in some ways sanitize what we do to some extent, but they also, it's basically the next frontier in many ways. And I know Denver, obviously, you're in those spaces, and it's really important to understand, though, that whether the effect is achieved through kinetic means or through cyber means, it's still a critical effect and could still have lasting consequences in our daily lives if things are not handled correctly.
And both, right? Cyber and kinetic, where cyber actually sort of molds the battle space.
Mm-hmm.
So we know where to hit, because cyber can actually push it to certain targets we want. But we could go into, I tell you, I wonder, with individuals, I love to talk about AOC, EOC, WOC, or WOC, operations.
Mm-hmm.
We could go into that all day. People would love it, I think. But,
Mm-hmm.
we established, right? When we were doing our interviews today, we established it's a great military operation. And I don't want to get you into an area with any trouble based on the things that we all do.
Mm-hmm.
But looking at Venezuela specifically,
Mm-hmm.
and the things that we've seen in the past, how does this differ? People like from Noriega and things like that, people are like, oh, it's just the same. It's just the same. There is something a bit different here that's going on. And I really did respect your answers today on CNN when you're talking about Venezuela, is that boots on the ground, protecting oil fields, the things that you were talking about, which I also talked about exactly, which actually blew my mind when I compared our interviews.
Right.
This is insanely problematic. And
Mm-hmm.
and it's also insanely problematic that it seems that the reasoning and what President Trump said had nothing to do with democracy. It said it was only about how much oil we were going to have. And I
Mm-hmm.
know those were some of the things that would bother you also as a military man. But when you were talking about that and how problematic this could be, could you sort of expound on that a little bit?
Sure. Well, and I think that one of the things that that was really interesting is when you had your interview today, the one with Alex Witt, you talked about a lot of the things that I think were critically important. For example, the way in which you described how this really is going to be difficult because they're not going to, if they're talking boots on the ground, they're going to do it with potentially private contractors. I think you called them the son of Blackwater or something like that, right?
The grandchildren of Blackwater. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
And so this is a very dangerous area because there are certain rules that we follow in the military profession, and what concerns me about the Blackwater-like entities is that they often don't follow the same rules that that we're required to follow. And that might sound trivial, but the big problem with that is when you have a code of conduct and when you have laws of armed conflict and laws of warfare, you follow them so that you don't commit crimes against people that are innocents or that shouldn't, or for whatever reason are non-combatants. And even if you go after certain entities, even people that are shooting at you, you have to do it in a way that is as humane as possible. And this is the way they're doing these kinds of things. It really doesn't open things up in in the way that they should, because they are in essence making mercenaries, in putting mercenaries in places where they could cause a lot of damage to U.S. foreign policy. They could cause a lot of damage if things are mishandled in a way that would be hard to recover from in a diplomatic sense or in a political sense. So, when I look at what they are talking about here, the idea of going in and taking over the oil fields, first of all, it's a very expansive area. If you're looking at the Orinoco Delta in Venezuela. That is something that is a very large area. I think twice the size of Connecticut, if I remember correctly. And that's something that is a very difficult area to secure. And then you have the infrastructure. It's an absolutely decrepit infrastructure. Back in 2013, they were pumping out 3 million barrels a day. In 2025, it's less than a million. And what that shows is that they are, in essence, the Venezuelan Maduro government, and before that, the Chavez government, they were basically bilking the system that had existed before. Their national oil company, all of these economic entities basically were the cash-rich cows that these powerful people in Venezuela were taking from. And that specific situation created a mess for the country because oil production was decreased so much. They have all these oil reserves, 303 billion barrels of oil.
That number, could you just repeat that number for everybody? Just repeat that number very quickly, Cedric Leighton, Brad Pitt, very quickly.
303 billion barrels of oil, proven reserves, billion. And that's far higher than what we have in the United States, far higher than what's in the United Arab Emirates, far higher than what's in Russia, far higher than Iraq, Saudi Arabia, and that's amazing. Now, that oil is actually heavy oil. It's called heavy oil, and it's harder to refine than the lighter crude that is often produced in Middle Eastern countries. But it is, clearly a resource. It's clearly something that, obviously the Trump administration covets, but it's going to take a long time to fix this. This is not going to be something where we can access those oil reserves quickly. It's going to take years to do it right. And my fear is that we're not going to do it right.
We have smart listeners on here. And this has been so fascinating because I have this issue. Geography is important. And when you look at Venezuela, which is sort of in the northern portion of South America, you look left and right? And you wonder about spillover, right, into Guyana and Suriname, when you're talking about to the east. When you're talking to the west, Colombia, so, south, right, into Brazil. Yeah. And people are probably getting out their maps like, oh my God, Denver, your geography. Remember, we went through intelligence school. I just want to tell people this, and I don't know if you remember this, Colonel. We had to memorize all 193 countries. This was 193 countries, I think, in 1998. And we had to memorize every single one of them and had a test on it. And let me not as easy as you think to memorize all 193 countries, but when you're looking at it, and the political thing is when you look at MAGA specifically, and I don't want to get too political, because I'll get political after you get off here even more. But when you're looking at the comorbidities that are happening with MAGA, when you're talking about the craziness of the Epstein files, when you're looking at about red districts being adversely affected by Medicare, Medicaid, and health, look at this third thing about this sort of this nationalistic push that MAGA has, right? It's very nationalistic. It wants to be anti-war. That was one of the things that Trump campaigned on. Now that we're going into Venezuela with the cost, me and you are thinking about the infrastructure costs. We're thinking about the amount of money. We're thinking about what oil companies have to do. We're thinking about what actually goes on there. What is that spillage? Because people don't know this. Guyana, I think 75% of Guyana, those oil reserves are in the billions in potential also, 70 to 75% owned by Exxon and Chevron, right, Colonel? So right. There's all this is happening. And I know that we're sort of teaching people here. And I just, before we get into the political thing, the sort of the baseline of what's going on. And when you're looking at the northern part, of South America. So that spillover effect, this nationalist effect, the money that we could be actually expending there, and just not taxpayer dollars, but it feels like oil companies look like this is a really good time. Contractors for infrastructure, contractors to build. But Colonel, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but looking at this politically downstream, do you even feel there's a plan except for oil based on what President Trump said himself? The night before somebody said it's going to be conspiracy theories. This is conspiracy theories, telling people that facts are conspiracy theories, that this was only done for oil. Then the next morning, Donald Trump comes out and says, this is done for oil. We're going to sell it to China.
Yeah. And I think what he's thinking about there, just real quick, is he's hoping to get some kind of leverage over China, because China has rare earths, and to a considerable extent, in some cases, well over 90% of certain minerals are controlled solely by the Chinese. In some cases, close to 100%, and that's a clear vulnerability from a strategic standpoint. You have that factor in there, so you look at, okay, so he's hoping to get leverage that way, but here's the problem. And so you mentioned when we were talking about the geography, you mentioned the eastern part that borders on Guyana. Well, there's a place, this region is called the Essequibo region. And before we got into this situation, I guess we'll call it, with Venezuela, the Venezuelans were making noise about invading Guyana in order to take over the Essequibo region in its entirety. And why were they going to do that? Because they wanted the oil that is currently on Guyanese territory. So there's a lot of this stuff going back and forth, and we were actually getting ready to support Guyana in any fight that they might potentially have with Venezuela. So this is going to be interesting to see where that goes now that Maduro has been removed, vacated, I guess, from the seat of power. But that's a major thing. And then on the west, you mentioned Colombia. Well, for years, we've had a counter-drug partnership with the Colombians. Now, people are going to say, but drugs are still flowing in the United States, even though we've had this partnership with the Colombians. And that is absolutely a valid criticism. But when you go back to the days of the Medellin cartel and Pablo Escobar, so we're talking the 80s and the 90s, before Escobar was killed by the Colombian National Police, with a lot of U.S. help, by the way. That is the kind of thing where we had this alliance with them, and the current administration is denigrating that alliance. So if Colombia is going to be a partner in the war against drugs, we've probably lost them, given the rhetoric that's come from the administration. And we're looking at Venezuela as a source of the way the administration was characterizing it. They were saying that, they were focusing on fentanyl, but very little fentanyl comes out of Venezuela.
Exactly right.
It doesn't.
It just doesn't.
And so you look at, so here's the problem that a lot of us, I think, have, is we're looking at extremely well executed operation to remove Maduro from power, but it's based on a lot of premises that are at best faulty and at worst false. And that becomes a real issue. If you have an instrument of power at your disposal, like the U.S. military, and you are using it because of, for ideological reasons, for whatever preconceptions that you might have, without regard to what's actually going on or what the actual background of a certain situation is, that is problematic. And I think we're in that phase where we have to be really careful how the instruments of national power are used, especially if they are used when the premise of the action is not mirroring the facts, the actual facts on the ground.
Brilliantly stated. And why, one thing that's great about this show, I try to be completely honest in a facts-based way with my audience, even sometimes if they don't agree on everything and things like that, because this is how we have to have this dialogue. Mm-hmm. And the dialogue here is that we can champion the operational veracity or the operational excellence of a specific mission, but the why reverberates. There's cascading effects if things are done outside of good foreign policy thought processes. Mm-hmm. And if we're going in on Maduro and we have them talking about drugs, you don't have, and I think you've noticed this, and I think everybody listening will notice this, there is no cogent message coming from the National Command Authority on why we did it. Rubio is not saying the same things Trump is.
Right.
And it's been fascinating to me. We have to stop a drug dealer. Well, you just, and this was a great question. I think it was on Meet the Press. I'm trying to remember if it was Meet the Press, or if it was ABC, but I'm trying to remember which one it was on. But they said, well, hey, then why in the heck did he actually pardon the Honduran president?
Yes.
Right. Drug dealer. That doesn't make any sense. And Rubio couldn't answer the question. He was, like a pig looking at a wristwatch, right? He didn't quite know how to actually, get to that. So I think those are some of the things we're looking at, that when you're coming from a military foreign policy perspective, and we're both pretty good at it, I think, you start looking at the cascading effects, and you look at the geography of the region and what message that is sending for any long-term issues that not only private parties might have there, like contractors or private industrial companies. I would say that they're the grandsons of Halliburton, right?
Yes.
You have all this happening, and the big oil companies. How in the heck, sir? And then I'll end here. How in the heck do we get our arms around it? And how in the heck do we square these type of activities that are coming from documents that, a lot of people said never happened, like Project 2025, things like that? It seems like they're following this exact playbook from those who look like that regionalism is where we want to be, and we don't really care what's happening in Ukraine or China anymore. And this is what I want to end on, is that if we do this, what gives us the clarity, that ability to say maybe Russia shouldn't be in Ukraine, or maybe China shouldn't be doing exercises in near Taiwan in the South China Sea? Those are the things that I look at it from an intelligence officer perspective, also from a political perspective, but an operational downflow perspective. And we'll end on this thing is, what are your thoughts on those? And if you're like, gosh, Dan, that's too big of a question to answer right now, we can have you come back. But what is your, thoughts on that as far as the downflow effects with the things that I just mentioned? When you're talking about China, you're talking about Ukraine, and you're talking about this sort of this re-hemispherization, right? That was sort of talked about, where it looks like we're going back to some kind of weird, distorted Monroe Doctrine thing.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. So, what did he call it? The Don Rowe Doctrine or something like that. So the Monroe Doctrine, was obviously created in a time when the President Monroe was thinking about keeping European colonial powers out of the Western Hemisphere. Totally legitimate reason in the 1820s, because it wasn't that long before that European powers dominated both America's North and South, and they had just basically vacated them from most of South America by that time. With Simon Bolivar and and Jose de San Martin and the other patriots, in the South American independence pantheon.
Done.
But thanks. But the thing that's interesting, you mentioned Project 2025. Yeah, absolutely. The roots of what then was transferred into the national security strategy that the administration just released, they're definitely discernible. There is this re-hemispherization, as you call it. That is exactly what is happening. So what is interesting to me about that is that in a world that was recognized basically as a global world, a globalist world, if you will, over 100 years ago, before even World War I occurred, obviously with the interruption of the 1920s, when isolationism was a preferred flavor of the month, during in the U.S., post World War I. But with that exception, the technologies of the time, the way in which people communicated, especially, all of those things, the migration flows, all of that pointed to a very, very, very globalized world. And what I mean by that is that there was this interchange of cultures and people, and you had ideas, you had fashions that went from one part to the other. And what's always interesting to me, even if you look at pictures from 100 years ago, the fact that fashion came, when you look at people's clothes, they look basically the same, whether you're looking in Europe or in the Americas. And that was as far back as 100 years ago. And we have basically the same thing, only on steroids now. So what they're trying to do in this administration seems to be, with this re-hemispherization, is they're trying to go back to a time that actually really didn't exist. But they have this idealized picture that these, that we have to, take care of things within our local neighborhood. The danger of that is this, that spheres of influence are going to all of a sudden become the way we conduct geopolitics. That means that Russia gets its piece, China gets its piece, the US gets its piece, and some other country, maybe Liechtenstein, gets another piece. And, Liechtenstein being the facetious entry here, but these are
the powerful Liechtenstein.
Powerful Liechtenstein. And with cyber, who knows? Things can happen, nowadays with interesting effects. But, the great powers of the world, I think, the Trump administration, whether they say it out loud or not, and sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, they're looking at ways of influencing certain spheres, and then they don't care about other areas when they say things like, well, that's on another continent far, far away. Well, Venezuela's on another continent. It's in South America, not North America, just as an example. Yes, it's closer, but things that happen in Venezuela affect us. Things that happen in Ukraine affect us. Things that happen in Taiwan affect us, especially when all your chips come from a place called, a company called TSMC.
TSMC. And yeah, that, people Google it.
And yeah, absolutely. Because the key thing here, Denver, is this. We are so interdependent that we have to secure those interdependencies in order to ensure our way of life and our freedoms. And that means that we have to engage in places like Ukraine, because you can't have a country taking over another one against its will. You can't have the Chinese going after Taiwan and cutting off that area, or being active in the South China Sea and cutting off those shipping lanes, because that has a similar effect on trade. And, the withdrawal, like if we withdraw right now, I can assure you that within, it's probably even going to be less than that, but definitely within a decade, we will be back on that stage, but having to work twice as hard, 3 times as hard, 4 times as hard than we would otherwise have to work to regain not only necessary influence, but to keep bad actors from cutting us off from the raw materials that we need, the intellectual property that we want to keep or exploit, and basically the freedoms that we enjoy in many parts of the world because of the things that we sacrificed or previous generations sacrificed in years past. And that becomes a critical thing, because what folks fought for and our ancestors fought for in World War II or World War I, those were key elements of our national identity, and to throw those away in the name of expediency or in the name of America first or something like that, that's a very dangerous thing, because that can happen. These things can really change the way in which our lives are led. And if we change that, if we fail to recognize the key elements there of what really makes us tick, how the global influences actually are important to us, then we lose focus on what really makes us the nation that we are today, and makes us lose focus on the future as well.
Tell you what, sir, from an undisclosed location, those wise words, those sober words, we're going to end with that tonight, but I hope you do come back, because I'll tell you, this is one smart audience. And I think they just heard exactly what you were putting out there in a very dignified way. And thank you for your service. Thank you for being my friend. Thank you for everything you've done for this country. And thank you for coming on tonight, sir. I do appreciate you.
Oh, Denver, thanks so much for having me. And, your friendship is critically important. And I really, really appreciate that as well. And it's great that, as you said earlier, we breathed the same air in many, many places before. And this was awesome to be with you tonight.
Sir, it was fantastic. Thank you. I'll see you later. And you enjoy your night, and love to your family.
Thanks so much, Denver. Same to you and to yours.
See you, sir. Okay. My goodness. I tell you what, it's incredible, right? When me and the Colonel talk, he calls me Congressman Denver. I call him Cedric, Sir Colonel. There's this respect thing that happens downstream based on where you've served, the things that you've done. And Doug got to hear some of the stuff that we had done where we were literally, he was actually feeding data from his location, the Air Operations Center, out to the Expeditionary Operations Centers. I was with the B-1s and the B-52s. And we actually knew some of the same intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets. I worked for an organization, Air Force, and as a contractor at NSA for something called Big Safari, which does not only exploitation, but also does something called quick reaction capabilities. We build things very quickly for warfighters. But what's amazing in our Air Force career is that we crossed over all the way from Operation Allied Force to Operation Enduring Freedom, Operation Allied Force being Eastern Europe, all the way through 2001, all the way to where the National Tactical Integration Offices, where we take, when he talked about satellites or national assets, how we actually merged or fused these sort of overhead assets with ground assets, with human assets, and with aircraft, and with, even back then, in the early 2000s, we were really perfecting the unmanned aerial vehicle surveillance and reconnaissance with predators, if you guys remember. So Preds. So pretty incredible that we were doing some of those same things in different places, and we're walking in the same hallways. Didn't see each other. But it's incredible to hear somebody who's had that kind of service, and you wonder, I would say while we were talking, it is people like me and Colonel Leighton that should be still in service. I don't know if Colonel Leighton will ever run for office. I know that I think I might have one more run in me, but as we were talking, and I'm not going to look at your comments because Doug would get mad if I did not have my private chat up. He would yell at me and scream. But when I'm looking at what's going on out there today, and I hope you heard what he said, there's a big difference between operational success and smart foreign policy decision-making. And there's a big problem with isolationism or making decisions based on a specific country or people's needs with personal wealth or decision-making that's not about American citizens. That is something that bothers me, and it should bother you. There were, as you heard, upsides. I was talking to, today, people are like, oh, come on, Dennett, there are upsides in some ways to what we did in going after Maduro and in Venezuela. We can paint it that way. We can turn it that way if we want to. But the upsides can't overwhelm the reason we're doing something or the moral authority, constitutional, or separation of powers, or why we do something. And I know there's some nuance there. Because, military, when we were looking at Venezuela and you heard about our background, we know it. We know South America. I remember I was doing an operation once where literally tracking hostages on a donkey. I can't go into it too much, right? But when you're tracking asses in the jungle, things are going crazy, right? Tracking asses in the jungle. But that's what we were doing. Literally tracking mules. And, and when you think about the assets that we must have had in place, when you're looking at Colombia, you're looking at Peru, right? And I can go through, I've been to these places. When you're talking about Belt and Road in China in 2020, I went all the way through there doing investigations for Congress. I was on the Financial Services Committee. I was literally writing legislation on Chinese Belt and Road requirements and state-owned enterprises and our companies doing business with them. So I was in Argentina, I was in Peru, I was in Panama, I was in Costa Rica. I got to work the Panama Canal. I got to push the buttons. But those are some of the things that when you're listening to Colonel Leighton, as you're listening to this experience in a sober way of warning us about what's happening, which I tried to do today. And that's why we were laughing about our interviews and how similar they were. Mine was a little bit more directed, though. You guys know I like to punch first sometimes. So when we're talking about punching first, I want to talk about January 6th and our 5-year anniversary coming up here. And in my plea, do I actually read all these text messages on January 6th? Do I go through all of them? I don't know how to contextualize 2319. And literally, you guys should be reading The Breach. And I haven't said this out front, but go to the library, rent it. Can you rent a book, Doug? So rent it. Go rent a book like a car. Go to Avis, rent a book. But go borrow a book from somebody, buy a book, whatever you got to do. Doug's laughing off stage right now because of what I just said, and it is funny. But my God, why aren't you spreading the word here? Um, buy it used for $5. I'm sure somebody has some ratty copy of The Breach somewhere, but go get it, right? Go get it. So I'm thinking about reading a selected portion on Tuesday, January 6th, maybe 100 or 200 of them that are really hard hitting. Literally hundreds of the texts are outlined and contextualized in the book, The Breach. Also, Hunter Walker, my co-author, and I don't know where he got all the text messages, but he actually put out an interactive thing through TPM, right? So that you can actually look at all these text messages. But I think me reading them in my voice, knowing the contextualization and being able to tell you why it's so important might be helpful. So I'm going to try to figure that out. And I'm thinking, Doug and I were talking between 9:30 or 10 a.m. On that day that we're going to do it. So again, there you have it. I don't know if there's any questions that people want to ask me and I can go over. And Doug, I don't know if there's some questions out there or anybody has any, because, I like to end off with the audience. I really appreciate all of you. Thank you for being patient with me as we're doing these type of things. We're even to the point, Doug and I are talking with a dear friend named Dot about, do we actually start The Breach Media? I mean, I own the IP. I have a New York Times bestseller. I think I wrote the only book on January 6th and the date. I think I've written the only thing out there except for the J6 thing, except for far right conspiracy theorists writing stupid shit about January 6th. But I think we might start to Breach Media in a Breach show that's very serious and very directed. And I think also, right, we're talking about Denver After Dark staying right as the actual baseline at night when we do crazy stories. Like I was talking to Doug and Dot today, and we're talking about the story, of parents, right, that are out there deworming their children preemptively. Anyway, so, and I don't know if that should be a thing because I don't remember being dewormed as a child. Now, I did eat at a bad Mexican place once and thought I had it when I was 12, but but I don't remember being dewormed as a child. I'm sorry. I try to do this straight, Doug, and I just sometimes can't. It's just ludicrous. But that's the new conspiratorial thing from millennial moms. I've heard maybe some Gen X. There's not a whole lot of Gen X moms. I guess, some can start a little later, I suppose. But I guess millennial moms are really into this. And I'd love to talk to them about the deworming the program, if we could. So anyhow, so we're thinking about Breach Media. I think we should do it. And I also believe that January 6th should never be forgotten. And I wonder if I should do it every year, read some of these text messages, because if you do, it's absolutely terrifying. I could bring them up, read them, and talk about it. I hope you guys turn in. My biggest fear too is everybody says they want me to read them and 12 people are watching while I'm taking, a few hours trying to explain this. And, there is a fear of that because you guys also know I run multiple companies and they are robust. But I feel like this is a service that I have to do. I can't let people forget what happened that day. I can't let it be whitewashed. I'm not going to allow it. So I thank all of you for your support. You're going to see more of me. I don't want to wear out my welcome, but you're going to see more of me. And Doug's going to get his wish. We're going to do more shite, but we're going to, I know a lot. And just like with that Colonel Leighton discussion, I know a bit. And I think that maybe I can help folks with ammunition based on data and facts, and maybe a little bit of that million-pound shit hammer of common sense I think that we can bring to bear. Appreciate all of you tonight. I know this isn't this big ending. Doug's probably not going to let me show the video of me dancing with aliens tonight, which is one of my favorite videos of all time. He just shook his head no. But I want to tell you guys right now, the fight's just beginning. I appreciate all of you. Spread the word. There's never going to be a time where you're not going to have access to what I'm saying. And I just want to let everybody know that. So thank you guys. Denver After Dark's out. Enjoy your Sunday night. And this was the best 45 minutes I could have ever spent. Thank you guys. I'm out.